Hello and welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour, the weekly bridge to the future of the piano tech community. I'm David Anderson.
And I'm Ethan Janney. And we're here to ask great questions, and then we'll shut up and listen to some of the authorities, experts, and most outstanding personalities in our little world of pianos.
So, put on your best set of headphones and let's get started.
We're here for another fun-filled Saturday afternoon or late morning or midnight or wherever you are in the world. Maybe it's Sunday, maybe it's Friday, I don't even know. That's one of the advantages we have here. But welcome everyone. Thanks for being here yet again. Appreciate your presence. And we have a special guest today, and that is Chris Brown. And I'll give a quick intro, because we're streaming on Facebook and YouTube for those who are unfamiliar with this type of session. And we'll get rolling chatting about what Chris would like to cover today. So what are we doing here? This is Piano Tech Radio Hour, and this is a special program that meets every Saturday and has been doing so for, maybe a year and a half at this point. We bring in some of the coolest people in the piano industry, from technicians to dealers to CEOs of piano companies to musicians, and we have some really great conversations just about how to push the envelope in pianos, whether it be making pianos sound and play the best they can, or creating the most optimal designs. And so if you're here, that means you're at the forefront and you have a passion to do the best at what you do in the piano industry. So really happy to have you here. This session and all these sessions are brought to us by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, which is a related project, an online educational resource that offers you cutting-edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. You can find out more at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. And since the pandemic, we've been doing online conventions, which has been pretty awesome, where previously we were just doing kind of one class at a time. We've started to have a series of days or even over multiple weeks where we bring multiple instructors and viewers together and students together to have a bigger event, and that's been really fun. And we just have had one that's sort of launched in September, and we plan to have other content in the coming months that are related to it, a convention. And Chris actually participated in this. He showed us a little bit about hammer hanging, had some really excellent video content to show us more about that. So that was great. And so Chris is he's a technician, but he's also he's sort of like an engineer and manufacturer of sorts who makes custom tools and resources to help us regulate pianos. He's a teacher in his own right, and he knows a lot about actions and all sorts of aspects of pianos. So without further ado, I'll spotlight him and we'll get the conversation started. I think he would like to talk a little bit about a particular piano that he's been dealing with lately. And your questions, as always, are welcome. And we'll kick it off here. So how are you doing today, Chris?
Great. Yeah, thanks. Feel good. The weather is warm. It's not raining in spite of predictions.
Where are you located again?
Littleton, Massachusetts. So if you go west on Route 2, you cross first 95, then 495, and I'm about a mile from 495 and Route 2.
Okay.
Where they intersect. So a convenient place to be.
I know we were talking about you visiting your daughter in New Jersey. How far is that of a drive, or what do you do? Fly there? What's your?
If it's not weekend traffic, or if the timing isn't mistimed, it's 3 3/4 hours, and that's with an extra 10 miles an hour at each increment, approximately.
Right. Yeah, just enough to make it feel like a long trip, but short enough that you can take it in one day and still have fun. Cool. Well, Sorry you can't visit her at the moment. I know you're trying to be safe as possible with the COVID and everything, but we're glad to have you here. And yeah, tell us about this piano. You told me it's a 19th century, late 19th century Steinway D that you've been working on.
Yeah,
Tell us about what's exciting there.
1889, and it's a job that I'm helping finish up for somebody that can't finish it, a technician friend of mine. And so I received it and the terms of the job all fully formed. And Jude Reveley, who I partner with, assembled the parts and delivered it to me. And I have taken it to the piano, bedded the keyframe, taken samples. There's a whole series of things that I've ended up doing to get this to work with the least work, given that it's a very extensive job. So a deep regulation. It has new shanks and hammers. The shanks are 17 millimeter knuckle to center distance. And that is part of the interest in this. Another part of the interest is that somewhere, I think, possibly the early days of the accelerated action, the piano was rebuilt, and I think it was a factory rebuild. New soundboard, same plate. The case was modified with spade legs and painted black. The lovely music desk, which might have been broken for all I know, came off and a modern one put on it. And the action received a new key frame, keys, top stack, everything. And so that's kind of interesting. And in between 1889 and whenever that happened, there were a series of retooling at the factory. So the parts undergo shifts. The original Whippens would have had felt supporting the jacks, for instance, that didn't have a convenient screw to turn. These were long gone, and a slant heel. And anyway, what I received was the original Whippens from that particular rebuild, which now had verdigris in them. And part of that picture also is the rest cushions are the kind of abbreviated felt covered versions of the rest cushions. And between then and now, the keys have been recovered. So presumably the ivories got chipped and cracked and so forth. And, an okay job. One of the things that probably happened, which in the middle of my regulating the other day was discovered. The mover had said that there was a leg that was loose on the piano. And I was putting a damp chaser under it and noticed that the rear leg had 3 wedges on top of each other, tapped in and held in place by a screw rather than the cam lock block. So it was missing that. I assumed that was what he meant. But in fact, I later had a conversation with him on the phone, and it was a different leg he was talking about. So Jude was unavailable. He sent his assistant, who helped me by jacking up the base of the action, leg number 1, I guess, and it was really loose. So we knocked it off, and the little plate in the top of it was missing a screw. And the 3 of the 4 screws that were there, 2 of them, the plate rattled. So the one screw that was the right size sort of held that down, but was a bit loose. And the other two screws were bottomed out and sticking up. Can you imagine this as a repair that somebody did? Presumably the male part in the leg had broken and it was replaced, a replacement part was put in with these three screws, two of which weren't doing anything. And then there was a sort of a piece of cling film over the male part that gave a semblance of the thing not sliding around when you put the leg on. And then it did have an operating cam lock block. And it's been living like that for how long? And this is a piano that, you know, went through a variety of owners, I'm sure. It ended up at the Indian Hill Music Center and then belonging to somebody that worked there as it was replaced with a different piano. And the replacement male part was this loose in the female part. So it didn't fall out, but it was not locking it in place at all. Okay, so that's, you know, there are sort of layers of things that happen to this piano along the way. And as a regulator, receiving these things and trying to keep the budget at what it was, of which only a you know, part of it was probably already spent on parts and work. So anyway, we had you know, good quality parts. The I think it's Ray Negron's hammers. They needed some filing and work on the tails. It had, I think, Renner shanks, you know, with 17 millimeter knuckles. Anyways, kind of, because I'm receiving this sort of with the appearance that I can just regulate it, I don't go back to the beginning. So I discover as I'm leveling the keys that the keys are very near the top of their balance rail key pins. And when I set my samples for where I want to level the keys to, which is a little bit up from where they are, I find that the front key pins in the treble end of things are almost out of their bushings. Not a great situation. And I adjust the key pin in the case of the particular one that did have a problem, and proceeded. But eventually, I came to a place where I had to back up. And along the way, I shimmed the back rail cloth with 50 thousandths thick pieces of maple that I happen to have in hand that cut up to the right sizes. And the back rail cloth that had already been placed there wasn't as deep as you might like on this action, not deep enough to glue down the back side of it. So it's sort of sticking up and it's got felt underneath it. And then I put the shim underneath it, which brings it up quite a lot. It allowed me to take about half of the stack of punchings in the front rail out. But in the end, I took 15 thousandths out of all the balance rail and came down because I had to bring the sharps up relative to the naturals in order to accommodate the 17 millimeter knuckles. Now, I have heard from the official person in a public setting that it's not a problem, the modern parts since 1984, that they just regulate in, and they do, but they regulate in at the outer edges of what's acceptable. What works on this piano, and it did work. I didn't have to, start over with changing the knuckles or changing the parts, or changing the capstans or changing the whippings. This would have been, the ideal actually would have been to change the whipping heels a millimeter back toward the back rail and the capstans about a millimeter back. And both of those proportionately would have increased the amount of distance traveled relative and added a little bit of weight, effective weight. And the 17 millimeter knuckles is a standard now. And in the Steinway, it was designed to accommodate a heavier set of hammers, which were designed to project to the back of bigger halls, presumably. When they introduced the accelerated action, which, by the way, I think, it's a very interesting concept that as you go over this half round, you start off with one leverage, and your leverage is increasing the speed and the distance that the hammer is, the key is traveling, and thereby the whipping and the hammer at the other end. And effectively, you have the least weight at the beginning of the stroke and the most at the end of it. So this is quite a clever addition, but when they did it, in order to fit it in, they didn't want to change the elevations of the pin block and the plate and the case and the haul that entailed. So coupled with, there might have been other reasons, but the keys went from being about 1 1/8 inches tall. These keys are 15/16. So they're undersized. The original keys would have had shoes on them, probably made of hardwood, stiffening the keys. On top, in a concert grand, you would have had buttons that extended and had a second layer of button on top of it. So you had all the stiffening down in the base in particular that was sacrificed in order to get this, was it a selling device? What's the word for it? It's a cool idea, and it actually, is interesting in the way it works. And one aspect that I like about it is I don't like if you need to slip a punching in, but when you get the top stack off and you're changing punchings, it's easier to just slip the half round and put your punchings in. But it's anyway, this piano from 1889 had dimensions from 1889. And the key frame has these half rounds in it. And then in the switch to the 17 millimeter knuckle, I'm fielding the problem that the Steinway company had in 1984 with their B's and D's when they first went to the 17 millimeter knuckle. They hadn't prepared the rest of the geometry for it. They just plugged them into the top stacks that were there. And you had to have your sharps too high and burying in the naturals and, super deep key dip. Well, the key dip on this piano is typical of a 17 millimeter knuckle in my estimation when I have 1 3/4 inch blow distance. Sorry for the mix and match between millimeters and inches, but that's just the way I've come to think. Yeah, shortening your blow distance less than 1 3/4 inches takes away from the power of the pianos, importantly. And 1 7/8 inches, which, maybe you'd like in a concert grand, you can't achieve, in my opinion, with a 17 millimeter knuckle. You just can't do it. Or if you do it, you've got to have a super deep dip. So the dip on this piano is 430, measured with calipers and a W&G dip tool at the front of the key. And the sharps are 31/64 high, so they're just under 1/2 inch. half an inch is the max. It's nicer if they're a bit less. They would have been designed a bit lower than that originally. And it has enough, just enough comfortable clearance of the naturals at full dip for the sharps. So it just works, but it pushes that envelope right to its max. And so if you're not careful, there could be other things about the action. And in this case, the keyframe setup and the key pins that could mean that you have trouble. And so the trouble that caused me to have to take puncheons out, which we all hate to do, particularly with the half rounds, was in the sharps. Because the sharps went up, the general situation that was a bit tight of having enough front key pin in the mortise and enough key pin sticking out of the balance button with this increased back rail claw meant that that some of the sharps were dangerously close to the top of their pins. And so 15 thousandths doesn't sound like much. It's 30 thousandths at the front of the key. But it was just right, just enough. And actually, there were a couple of keys where there was only maybe 10 or 15 thousandths left. So it was the bottom of what, if I started from scratch, that's where I would have started, really. And of course, I'm using a crowned key level. That's just my choice. And speaking of crowning, there's a certain amount of crown to the plate, which is also a typical thing. And it means that your string heights are higher in the middle of the action than they are at the ends. So if we as technicians go measuring distances from the ends, which without a regulation station is pretty much what you're stuck with, because that's what you can access and see, what you get at 88 and number 1 is less than string height wise than what you have in the middle. And the center pins may or may not all be in a straight line, but I like to custom bore for that reason. And I measure down samples at ends of sections to find out the distance between that center pin and the strings at stripe. And that is basically, once everything's filed and ready, that should be your blow distance. And it erodes from that and overstrikes from there, but that's your ideal. But whatever you choose in a relationship to that, to reflect the change in height, helps the regulator be able to regulate without undue compromise. Now, in particular, one of the things that happens is that the hammers in the middle of the action, in mid-range, have insufficient tail length and back check length, making the back checking a little difficult. But also, they have too much space between the shank and the rest cushion. And the rest cushion is a stop. And normally, it doesn't seem a very important stop, but if there's too much distance, what happens is the hammer comes down and the rear shoulder bumps on the top of the back check. So it's not something you want to leave, particularly in a concert instrument. So this instrument is going to somebody's living room, but she has concertizing friends. And in fact, at the end of next week, this is supposed to be completed for a salon type home concert with, a concert pianist playing on it. So I'm sure they're used to it, concert pianists. They're used to all kinds of stuff. But the more obstructions we can remove, the better. So anyway, I find it interesting that, the Steinway company themselves, one of the best makers on the planet, all kinds of resources. They've been successful relative to most of the other people on the planet. They still go through constraints of retooling, how do you keep the public's imagination and continue to sell pianos? How do you satisfy the best concert artists? I mean, really, the whole business with the heavier hammers and the accelerated action, was that really needed by the general public? I don't know. Was there a clamor for such a thing? I don't think so. The very lightweight hammers from the heyday years, say pre-1925 or something. They're beautiful tone, plenty of projection, and most of us don't have a concert hall that is too big with all the interference that entails. So anyway, you're faced with a set of choices as a regulator. What do you leave the way it is? And what do you encourage your customer to pay for changing? What are you forced to change? And in my case, I like to weigh off when I do a deep regulation because inevitably things have changed. They start changing when the piano's brand new. The hammer's where they get filed. And by the time you regulate it, they could have been filed a couple of times. They could be very light. They could be 75 years older and dried out and lighter for that reason. And they were pretty light to begin with. So one of the things about this 30s accelerated action is its way off, which was pattern leading. And pattern leading is a reasonable factory approach to things.
Did you see this comment from Larry?
No, sorry.
He said the accelerated action was the brainchild of pianist Joseph Hoffman.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, you can, probably Larry has even more of that story, but yeah, you can see how an influential pianist could,
of that player, except I think he had a big ego and a big stage presence, and he wanted to fill bigger and bigger halls with more punch, perhaps. Larry, is that right, or am I misremembering?
As you alluded to before, it also probably turned into a marketing.
That's what I was trying to think of. It shows you where I'm at. I'm terrible at marketing because I can't even think of the word for it.
Hoffman was actually a prolific inventor, not only of piano-related items, but he invented automobile windshield wipers and shock absorbers and many other things. He was quite a genius.
Well, yeah, it is ingenious, really. He's taking something.
But who needs windshield wipers? It's just a marketing ploy. Oh, you'll drive safer. Come on.
Yeah, quite.
Sorry, Chris, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Pattern leading is a strategy that saves money in the factory, and it requires that you have tolerances of the things that are affected by the way off that are wide enough for it to work, because keys are different sizes, and the hammers at the other end are, their moldings can suddenly gain a gram or lose a gram as they go into the next flitch. And there are all kinds of things that contribute to irregularity. A principal one of which is friction. So in this piano, when I did a preliminary way off because I wanted to remove lead from the keys that didn't have enough upweight capability. And I found that, well, actually, if you trying to think, if you show, I have some videos that are sort of queued up ready. If you show just don't show the video, but just show the front of it with one of them.
Which one, the second or the third video?
The one with the picture of the keys.
All right, let's see what I got here. Okay. Here's this. All right.
Yeah.
We've got that one.
Not that one.
Steinway off.
Not that one.
Oh, the first one?
Yeah, let's try the first one.
All right, let's see if we can find that one. I'll pull it up here.
Yeah, don't worry. Anyway, the point is that I went along and marked with a little chalk 0 all the keys that are spot on for the 37 balance weight way off that I determined suited this action, given everything, by the time I got far enough along the regulation. And, about half the keys had zeros. Some of the zeros came about by removing lead or, let's see, does that show it? If you could get close enough, you would be able to. I think these are the keys that actually had lead that had to be removed. And in front of the buttons, there are little zeros along some of them. And then eventually I put my key weights up on the key where they're going to be installed. I use copper key weights rather than lead. My son has vetoed my using lead and including them in my way off kits. So they're a lot more expensive and they're different to work with. But and they're a little bit lighter than lead. But anyway, in an accelerated action, you have to place them specifically where you want them, and there's lead in the way a certain percentage of the time. So there's a calculation that I needed to remove lead. Well, actually, it's not that hard to remove exactly what you want. You just have to put lead on the other side of the balance rail. That is what you need, and then measure back out to the lead that is approximately that distance and then remove it. You guys follow that? So anyway, I was doing this preliminary run, and there was one key from the factory that had a lead at the backside, and then there was one key that had 3 extra leads that I needed to remove, and it turns out it was even worse than that later on when I refined it. Because I think they did way off by downweight, and it made an even downweight to do it the way they did it, whatever they touched up into it. But from my point of view, the upweight is more important than the downweight, and really I want the two to be even. And further than that, I'd really like to have the top hammers in the bass section match the bottom hammers in the tenor section in weight, so that I lose that inertia shelf as you go from the bass section into the tenor. And actually, with these hammers, I was able to do that because they were all 1 inch long, but they were heavy. There was a lot of material left on them, and which I think was the case with the previous set of hammers because they had torn up the back checks in the middle. Now, an interesting thing about the 1 inch tails is that originally the tails would have been about 1 inch and 1/8, or 1 inch and 1/16, certainly in the bass. and the beginning of the tenor. There's a little taper in the bass, and then it starts again in the tenor. And it ends up being about 7/8 of an inch in the high treble. And there is a reflection of that in this keyboard, which was, the 30s keyboard. So they were still doing it then, in that the back checks are different heights. So I noticed this as I'm setting my back checks, and I've done my aftertouch, and everything is, as hoped for, that down in the bass, I'm right near the top of the back check covering. And as I get into the middle, I'm further down. And by the time I get up to the high treble, I'm really quite far down in the back checks. And it's because the back checks are different heights, whereas my tails are all the same length, and my blow distance is all the same length. And anyway, to the credit of the Steinway style back check at that time, it actually has, they're wide and they're tall, and their covering isn't particularly tight over the felt, and it gets nicely caught in that buckskin. But the shape of it provided clearance to the ones in the bass and the ones in the high treble. It limited my where I could regulate it by that clearance with. And a gauge of it is if you put your hand and play your key with the hammer against your hand so that there's pressure, and you can feel a little scraping at the back, that's a hazard. Particularly down in the bass and the tenor where you have a lot of hammer mass, that's a hazard that you're going to be catching on the back check on your way up. So you have to stay away, clear that. And anyway, it's part of the fitting process. If I had done my back checks in relation to what I thought they ought to be on the back check, if I'd done my back checking relative to that, I would have had a problem. I'd have to pull it out and redo them. So way off, I have on my website, I have a series of, I think there are 10 articles that I've written. I've been very long-winded about this. The last two included some self-styled formulas that I contrived to describe the leverage transfer of weight and then that of distance. And they need to be different slightly in the real world, I found, which was interesting. But to the extent that I have an audience, I felt the audience sort of wandering off as soon as I introduced the real numbers and things that looked like algebra. And I have to admit that that is my personal problem too. And but understanding that relationship, the trade-off between, say, effectively gaining ground on your hammer weight. So you have a hammer that you want to be effectively lighter. If you move your knuckle, for instance, further out the shank of a small amount, without moving anything else, that actually has a double effect. You lengthen the effort arm relative to the resistance arm. Okay, so picture this on a seesaw that just goes like that, like the key. You've got people at both ends, and the lighter you make this person, if you don't change the differences, the less they're going to be able to tip things up in their favor. But the heavier you make this in that same spot, so the hammer, the more it's going to take to lift, and the more distance it will travel. And so if you want to make this lighter, you're going to do it at the expense of distance traveled at the far end of the action. So in the 15.5 millimeter knuckle, what is adequate at 390 with a dip is going to be inadequate if you change that to 17 millimeters. You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to shorten your blow distance. You need you need aftertouch. We can't get away without that follow through. And so we're pinched into doing something. Anyway, this is like a history of well, I suppose it's more specifically Steinway, and I'm more familiar with them than some. But the pushes and pulls of what they're after and what they think they need or think will sell, and the knock-on effects of changing things. And the knock-on effects of changing things is exactly what we as freelance technicians, or really as university technicians. By the way, the little blurb that says all the different things I've done, I didn't do them all at once. If I did, I would have been spread way too thin. But I did have a fairly long stint as a part-time university technician. And that was particularly challenging in my case because they were not a Steinway school. They did not have recent instruments. They had practice rooms full of pianos falling apart because they created these practice rooms around radiators that were designed for larger rooms. And they just, all the key tops came off, and oh my God.
I'm pretty sure we had that at my university too. Like each of these practice rooms has its own radiator sitting next to the piano, and a window, right?
And a window. And so the windows would go open.
And a radiator.
Yeah, the windows would go open in the winter because it would get way too hot in there.
Yeah.
And it would just super dry out these pianos. But anyway, in our toolkit needs to be a flexibility to adapt to what the thing is, and also to your customer. In the case of this university that I worked at, they did not have the budget for all these pianos that they had. So we had to pick and choose and decide which battlegrounds to try and improve things on. And so I go through, as I say, I've got these, I'm working on my 11th, actually. It's number 10 because I had a 3.5 or a 3A that are loosely on way off. But of course, all kinds of things in the action bear on way off. Way off is sort of a final touch. But my feeling at the start of it was that, and maybe it was true at a point in my career that I can recognize it as a generality, that, on the one hand, if it was good enough for Steinway, they know a lot more than I do. Who am I to change it? Coupled with, I don't know how to change it. How do I go about assessing what I should do and the details of doing it? And really, the details are not as, they're not arcane or particularly complicated, but they relate to the real world. And the way to get into that without higher math, and by the way, the higher math needed to really name a number that is spot on, is a lot higher than what I dabble in. And unnecessarily higher unless you're designing a piano, probably. But if you are designing a piano, it's pretty important. And, gravity works in a direction that goes toward, the virtual center of planet Earth. So your gravity in Illinois or California is not in the same direction as my gravity. They all are headed toward the same place or pulling from the same place. But in terms of our arcs, they're pulling essentially down, whereas the arc is going through changes on its way from rest position to the hammer striking the string. And is pulling here. It's got a different set of things that it's pulling on. The mass is in a different relationship. The leverage is in a different relationship as it goes through this. And it is very, very complicated if you want to really name it. But the thing is, it's like a human being. Okay, they have a name. Hi, Donnie. I know you by name. I know you from our little bit of past history. But, you know, Donnie is, we share a birthday, by the way.
That's right.
Oh, nice.
We went to North Bennett in the same class. But apart from that, I know her as a friend, but I don't know the many details that there are that make up Donnie.
You don't want to. You don't want to.
Well, I'm sure there's the pros and the cons, as with anybody. But naming the thing, that's what math is about. It's naming relationships. And a clever use of it is to anticipate or estimate what will happen if I do something. But the name is take pi, for instance. There's a tricky name because it goes on forever. Or how about just a third of something? It goes 0.333333333333. There isn't enough time to ever get there. And yet, you know, we can devise a way to get a third of something because the 3/3 have to add up to a whole. And so there's cleverness built into it, but we as technicians, we're pragmatists. We can feel gravity. We can stand up and, you know, walk someplace. We have built into us the power to estimate. And if we confidently take that and apply our imagination and our, you know, goodwill to solving something that is clearly a problem, sometimes it's a number of things that contribute to the problem. And in the case of an action, you've got materials that are settling. You have hammers that are being filed shorter or have been replaced. So one of the things about this point in my career is kind of interesting or ironic because I turned away for quite a long time to work on my tools. In the early days of my career, I had sort of nothing but Steinways and Mason and Hamlins, and everybody wanted me as, you know, the best new hope for their piano, I suppose. And they wanted me back. And I stopped going to people's homes, so I kind of severed that local connection in favor of a national relationship with other technicians. But now I find myself doing a bit more piano work again, which is really nice. But the ones I get, a lot of them come from technicians and they're jobs with complications. It might be that the customer is a complication, or like in this piano, you know, it was a history of moving on from one thing to another that left certain details unresolved. Another one had amateurish work all over the place that had to be unraveled and figured out. But, you know, I actually find it very rewarding, you know, assuming that I can continue to find a solution that actually satisfies all the various criteria. But largely I have. And largely that, anyway, my point coming all the way around the houses to it is that largely this is done by making a best guess and doing a sample. The better your guess, the less sampling you're going to have to do, the less time that will take you, the less onerous the process will seem. But if you don't do that, what is far more onerous is to get to your final visit at the customer's house where you think you're just going to push this action and touch up a couple of things, tune and voice. And it turns out there's something that, oh, if only I had done such and such. And then you soul search and you realize that this customer's already paying you a lot of money, and yeah, I got to do it. Not for pay, unless it was somebody else's fault, but often it's just our own fault for not having seen it. Whereas the earlier in the process, you can do a sample, you can put that into your proposal and run through your idea as accurately as possible. And there's a rub, obviously, is doing it as realistically as possible because everything's so interrelated. But once you start doing this, the thing about it is that experience keeps adding information in. Of course, a certain amount of the information, certainly in my case, has gone out the back door, it's wandered around, some is coming back in again, and maybe it's coming in, several times over, appearing to be new, but actually, maybe it's reinforcing what I should have concluded in the first place the first time it came through. I suppose that's another aspect of our kit is, it relates to flexibility, is to not expect to understand everything in one grok. That sometimes you have to let it simmer. And sometimes you don't have an option. The pressure's on. Early in my career, I found myself in a situation with a piano that was chosen by somebody else for a concert that had all kinds of money bags at the MFA, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. It was a fundraiser, and all the best donors were going to be in this audience at 8 p.m. And fortunately, I came in at 4 or something, a little on the early side, because this piano had been totally eaten by moth. It was a lovely case. It was, about 2 steps flat, 2 whole steps flat. All the bridle straps were perishing. So in order to do a couple of repairs and get into changing the punchings, I had to take out the keys. I had to take out the action. I had to put the keys back in one at a time, flipping out the jacks and hoping I didn't break anything. And with adrenaline going and a clear hierarchy of it, and this was early days, but I had a pretty clear notion of, each key had to play and it had to sound like it was in tune. And I kept the audience waiting 5 minutes in the end. I actually did it. And that has empowered me ever since, because I'm kind of a slow moving person. And as I get older, I make a feature of that. And part of that feature is this process of deciding on things that rather than numbers of times I've regretted the momentary pressured decision. In that particular case, with enough adrenaline going and enough at stake, I'm forced into, I'm not going to be changing sticker cloth, for instance, in a situation like that, period. There's no question about it. Sticker cloth, by the way, was something I did a lot of in my early days because it was easy to cut them nice and cleanly and glue them on, have everything look nice. And they made a lot less difference than some of the other things that, perhaps I was less confident about. Which brings me back to way off in a grand piano that I think for many of us, for most of the time, the symptom gets the treatment in terms of way off. So we have a particular key that won't lift enough up weight, and we take out a letter, we add a lead at the back of the key, period. But there's some version of that need in pretty much every action we do, and it's not appropriate in every action. The pattern leading was adequate in the brand new Steinway. If you can come within the parameters of the pattern leading in what you find, in what is given to you, then probably, unless you have a client asking for, money's no object, I want this piano to be what it can be, and you have that discussion, and they say, this is what I want. Often you just don't need to do it. You just regulate. If you've got a stable of Steinways at a university, the chances are that you're not going to have to go through and redo the way-offs. But to have the confidence to do it as needed as a global thing and not be dismayed at the prospect, I think is a very useful tool. And if you get to a place where people are asking you to do, or you're selling a deep regulation, and by that I mean you're doing the whole works from the start to the end, you're taking responsibility for each step. You're not just touching up the hammer line and the let off and drop. And as soon as you do that, now you've got friction involved, and you've got inertia and weight to worry about, and in particular upweight, and the evenness of things. So anything that can make it consistent and even removes obstructions from your player. Oh, and a little, I know I wander around, a little aside about players. So you can have, so I had a spinet customer, and she was not a great player. And I got forced into doing what at the time, nearly 40 years ago, was a $500 job, which I thought was, it was radical to a spinet at the time. But she had plenty of money, and I had just been through another spinet job that was disastrous, and I ate all kinds of time. And so I was insisting on this one. Well, turns out that her her husband was chairman of the board at the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and that they had John Williams and Yo-Yo Ma and all kinds of fancy people, including real piano players, stopping by, for Christmas carols or a social visit. It turns out that they ended up getting another piano, which I also worked on, but the spinet was the one that they initially had. And if you make assumptions just because it's a spinet, or just because the person that owns it isn't a great player, you could be making yourself vulnerable to, you might not even ever hear about it, but a kind of an indirect embarrassment. It's like, if you think it's not important to tune that top octave, okay, you're in a situation where the lights are coming on in 15 minutes and you got to touch things up. Forget the top octave, maybe, depending on what everything else is like and what that's like. You have to make a call. But if you're hired to tune the piano, you better tune all the strings of the piano. My opinion. Okay, I think I've reached the limit of the time, and I ought to answer a question if there were more time. But
yeah. What's that? John Ross said, Christopher, you've been very kind to share your time and highlight well and remind us all of the many decisions piano technicians are required to make every day. Alday Stewart said, thanks, Chris. Great info. Good to see you. Ethan, great as usual. Yeah, it's been fun. Appreciate it. Lots of good info, Chris, and appreciate you joining us again. And just a reminder to everybody that his lecture is available. It's going to be, we'll send a link out via email if a follow-up, unless Pooja can grab it before we jump. But yeah, you can purchase his lecture from the convention individually, or you can still sign up for the rest of the lecture conventions. We also had a really great one on piano design, which I think is kind of well related to what you were talking about. You can start to make these decisions that you're hesitant about at first when you understand more about piano design and why things happen. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, just to say that Chris Brown RPT is the name of my YouTube channel, and I'm posting every couple of days incrementally as I get to edit them, a series of videos on exactly this piano that we're talking about. And on my website, which is grandwork.tools, there's a blog series that I've referred to, and the latest one which involves this piano I'm working on at the moment. And, soon will be out, and please come visit and check it out.
Perfect. Yeah, and I put your YouTube channel link there in the chat, as well as your website link, so people could just click on that and go check it out right away and like it and bookmark it and follow it and do all this stuff. Looks like you have about 500 YouTube followers, and so that means there's a lot of good info up there. So keep tabs on Chris Brown. He's got some good stuff going on. All right, cool. Anything else before we jet today?
No, thanks for asking.
Okay, awesome. We'll see you all next week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time. Remember that you can catch us live online every Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
That's right. Go to pianotechradio.com to register so you can interact live and ask questions of our guests.
See you next week.